Hello, everyone, and welcome to Freud in Focus, a podcast from the Freud Museum, London, hosted by me, Tom DeRose. Now, for regular listeners, you'll know that mostly what we tend to do on these shows is to take a text of Freud's and examine it in quite close detail, under a microscope, if you will. But today we're going to be taking a slightly different approach on the programme. Rather than taking a text of Freud's, we're going to be reflecting on an event, and a rather special event, actually, that we had here at the Freud Museum in the summer of 2023. And this event was a theatrical workshop based around the themes of shame and violence in Shakespeare's great Jacobean tragedy, Macbeth. And I'm going to be joined on the programme today by three special guests. And these three characters, these three people were really the kind of main protagonists setting up this event and took an active part in the delivery of it. So firstly, we have Roman Gerodimos, who is Professor of Global Current Affairs at Bournemouth University. And then we have Professor Candida Yates, who is Professor of Culture and Communication at Bournemouth University, and of course is also an academic associate at the Freud Museum, London. And Mark Leipacker, who is Director of the acclaimed theatre ensemble, The Faction. And so why are we reflecting on this particular event today? Well, really, starts with this notion that Freud, of course, is such a keen reader of Shakespeare and is so fascinated by Shakespeare. Many listeners will know that Freud famously quotes Hamlet as a kind of counterpart, really, to the Oedipus Rex play by Sophocles, that Hamlet is a kind of Renaissance Oedipus figure. So every time almost that Freud refers to Oedipus in his work, he complements that reference by referring to Hamlet as well. We know that Freud was a great lover of Shakespeare, read his work kind of cover to cover in English, and drew a great deal of inspiration from Shakespeare. But it might be surprising to some people to know that there are actually more references to Macbeth in Freud's work than there are to Hamlet. Not something that we necessarily would think of. So Macbeth is also the subject of one of Freud's lengthiest kind of, I guess we would call it literary case studies in a paper called Some Character Types Met With in Analysis. So Macbeth and Shakespeare, and particularly Macbeth, are kind of really fertile soil, I think, for thinking about the influence that Freud has on literary theory and also the influence that theatre and literature has on Freudian theory itself. So that's kind of one reason why we're looking back on this event. And another reason really was because it was a part of a kind of broader research project that the Freud Museum entered into around these themes of shame and violence. And Macbeth was seen as a kind of paradigm case for studying these themes of shame and violence in the kind of theatrical way. So, Roman, what were the roots of this project? Where did it spring from? And if you could just unpack a little bit some of the groundwork and research that went into this kind of analysis of the relationship between shame and violence for us, please.
So our project was inspired by the work of James Gilligan on shame, guilt and violence. This has been James Gilligan's whole life project, basically, and also the shame violence intervention project championed by Jonathan Nasser at HMP Wandsworth. So these were the two sources of inspiration for me to further explore the links between shame and violence. And shame is really key to anger and violence dynamics, as I discovered as I was researching this further and further. And the more I researched this and the more we started working this book, the more we understood and we tried to chart the pathway between shame and the roots of shame, because shame itself has sort of existential and pre-moral and also deeper psychological roots, and then how that links to shame, and then how shame in terms is manifested in anger and sometimes violence, and then how that creates a vicious cycle. This is really key in shame and violence dynamics. You have an act of humiliation, and that leads to a violent response, which is in itself an act of humiliation, and then you have shaming and counter-shaming. So that sort of dynamic, that cycle of the offending act, and then how that accumulates. And sometimes, the receiver of the humiliation or the violence is somebody different, not even somebody innocent or somebody who's not even involved in the original act. All that is really fascinating and really, really fertile ground. So in this book, we try to offer a transferable model, if I may use this term, of how this dynamic works, but also how through shame awareness, how through, becoming aware of this dynamic, one can work towards healing and basically towards a form of therapy. Personally, what I find really fascinating, what I've been trying to do with this project is take a discussion that has taken place traditionally within psychoanalysis and psychology, and see whether and how it can be applied to different disciplines. So in this book, in this project, in the work we've done together and with Action, we've brought in and collaborated with all kinds of practitioners and scholars and writers and thinkers, from architecture to history to art to education to all kinds of fields, politics and so on. And this is only the first step, because there's no way you can exhaust this huge wealth of knowledge that is waiting to be discovered in one book. But it was just like a starting point. And in fact, since our event that we did at the Freud Museum, even more dimensions have emerged. So it's really quite extraordinary. The more work we do in this, the more we find, the more ground we find, the more space we find for exploration on this precise relationship between shame and violence. And how is this manifested in the body, in the mind, in workplaces, in organizations, at school, in the family, of course, and then even, sort of broader into societies, communities, and even between states. So at the core of psychosocial studies and our project is the idea that the individual interacts and is sort of interdependent with the social and vice versa. So we try to explore these dynamics as well.
That's great. And of course, I mean, the book you refer to is the kind of published by Palgrave Macmillan, of course, edited by yourself, entitled Interdisciplinary Applications of Shame Violence Theory. And I think that, as you were referencing, that was a kind of real springboard, wasn't it, for some of these kind of projects that we started to think about. We had a conference at the museum in the spring, which really came out of these different collaborations which were introduced by this book. But it really feels like this event that we had in the summer, this theatrical event, was something that almost helped to kind of reinvigorate some of those arguments, yes, exactly. and lead us to somewhere else. So what is it then, Roman, about about theatre, really, I guess, and perhaps particularly Macbeth, that helps us feel some of these arguments in a kind of more, I don't know, perhaps a more creative, a more fertile way, a different way of thinking about things that can help these thoughts and these arguments really permeate on a different level? Is there something particularly about that theatrical process, you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just a perfect space to experiment and explore the self and our relationships with others, in a safe space where you try different roles and different iterations of emotions and different dynamics, and it's all happening live during the workshop or during the rehearsal or during in fact the performance. And I just think it's just such a perfect, because it's so live and dynamic and malleable and porous. It's not really a sort of, a book is a book. I mean, of course, a book plays a huge role in articulating an argument and disseminating it, or a film or a program does it. But theater is much different, because it allows for that experimentation and for that interaction and exploration, and that's what we've tried to do with the awesome ensemble that Mark is leading. And in terms of Macbeth, I mean, I knew that we were going to find some interesting insights there about shame, but I never expected that this is like the manual of shame and violence, in Shakespeare. I mean, there's so many different threads, if you like, of the shame, violence, and then gender as well. Gender is, and we talk about gender in the book, and Carol Gilligan, the famous gender scholar, has an excellent contribution in the book. Gender is very key. It's one of the basic levers, if you like, of the mechanism of shame and violence. And then gender is huge in Macbeth. So all the different permeations, if you like, or iterations of how shame leads to violence appear in Macbeth. And so exploring that was, I know it's a cliche to say this word mind-blowing, but it really did blow my mind, basically. And especially seeing Mark and the actors bring that to life and embody that. And it's shame is a very physical thing. It's also mental, of course, it's emotional, but we underestimate perhaps how physical it is in the body and then how physical it is in the space. I've always been really fascinated by that idea of how do you create a scene, a stage, so that when a viewer walks in or an audience member walks in, they can like feel the shame in the air. Even there's nothing quite specific about it; it's just there. So how do you create that theatrically? In order to recreate that theatrically, you really have to drill down to the core of it and really understand how it works to then be able to reproduce it, which is what Mark and his team did.
It's great. I really get the feel that this kind of, as you were talking about, this kind of atmosphere that you can create as shame and that kind of almost plasticity of a kind of a workshop environment, which allows us for this notion of shame to be changeable and malleable and thinking of it from different positions. And the specificity of Macbeth, of course, as you mentioned, So, Mark, I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about some of, what happened in these workshops and in the rehearsals that kind of preceded the event that we had at the museum in the summer. What sort of things did you find out about kind of this play, about the process of it, and particularly about this kind of plasticity of shame, this malleability maybe of shame that Roman was discussing just now?
I mean, just a bit of background, first of all, that I should probably say that the reason why Roman and Candida and I sort of became to be working on the project is that Candida and I have a long-standing collaboration through a number of different productions. I won't sort of give you the repertoire now, but had a connection around the production of The Talented Mr. Ripley, where Candida came in and did two really great workshops with the actors on flirtation and on jealousy. Which are two really key strands of that play, and that sense of malleability and plasticity, and what you get in terms of different perspectives on a text. Not just from an actor's perspective, but from people with a great deal of knowledge about psychoanalysis coming into a space and sharing their knowledge, their experience, their understandings of these different texts in the way that we're talking about in Macbeth. Opens up a brand new landscape, really, that's sort of a really new perspective, a new angle within a rehearsal room. So that plasticity and that malleability is something that is in more than one direction. I think it's really important to express that. And so reached out to Candida when working on Macbeth, thinking originally, to be honest, about the idea of absent children, and that the absent child is a really central part of that play. I'm wondering what the psychoanalytic perspective on that might be, and that gets into, I think, this idea of the originating act. But really, Candida and then Roman introduced us to these ideas of shame and violence, and the shame and violence cycle being in the play. And I 100% want to concur with what Roman just said about Macbeth being the sort of manual on shame and violence within Shakespeare. Actually, I was absolutely staggered by how much of the research that Roman has just spoken about is present. It's embedded in that text. And so to be able to unpick those strands, to identify them, first of all, to see and feel their presence, and then with the information and the perspectives and the contributions of Roman and Candida, we were working in the rehearsal room with two actors, Christopher York and Sophie Spreadbury, and to have them really go through the process that an actor goes through of taking different stimuli and processing and embodying them. And I think that idea of embodied shame that Roman introduced as well is very important. To be able to see that made manifest and represented in a rehearsal room is really quite a staggering thing. And it's really down to the skill of those actors, but also the ways in which ideas and concepts and theories and analysis were introduced into the space in such a brilliant way, and the way that it was shared. It was truly collaborative. And I think that idea of collaboration and the multiple directions of the knowledge exchange and the cultural exchange is really what we're talking about when we're talking about plasticity and malleability, I think.
There's a certain risk involved, isn't there, of course, in this as well, of taking yourself, allowing yourself to learn something new from someone from a different discipline, opening yourself up to new knowledge, allowing that kind of movement of thought, I guess, Mark, as well, isn't there? There's something quite fragile about that process, right? I mean, you did talk about the notion of shame being embodied, and we've also had the idea of it being something like an atmosphere as well. So I wonder, does that kind of make sense to you as well, that the fact that it feels like this kind of moves around and can almost inhabit people through the process?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that idea of risk in and of itself is quite an interesting one. Rehearsal room, it can be quite a fragile space. I mean, hopefully you build it up in a healthy way and it's a healthy environment for people to take risks. I mean, that's the more positive way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. But I think that idea of risk and that idea of failure is quite interesting in terms of its connection to shame as well.
Right. Yeah.
So actually you have these multiple levels at play while you're in a rehearsal room. And I think that one of the key discoveries, or the key moments, I think, for all of us when we were in the rehearsal room that day, was actually this idea of looking at the Weird Sisters as characters. And again, just for a bit of context, I should explain that the production of Macbeth that we were working on featured only those two actors, Christopher York and Sophie Spreadbury, that I've mentioned. So it was really a sort of microscopic look at the journey of the Macbeths as they go through the play. Of course, the content of the Weird Sisters still being very important, and this idea of what is predetermined, what is fate, and what is choice and free will. And actually the Weird Sisters trying to find through two actors and through this sort of unusual way we were choosing to tell the play or share the play, how the Weird Sisters might manifest themselves. And actually this idea of the shame being embodied and the shame being physicalized led to quite an extraordinary moment in the rehearsal room of the two actors really sort of shaming themselves through things in a very private, very secure, I hope, a very respectful way, given the space and time, whilst being observed, not necessarily being scrutinized in the way that you're really focusing on actors when they're producing material, but giving them the space to really use their knowledge of themselves, use ideas of shame that were being introduced, and to find a way to bring that into their bodies. To physicalize and make manifest that embodied shame, and thereby construct a sort of shame monster that was in effect what the Weird Sisters were. So they were simultaneously external ghostly visitations, the spirits that Lady Macbeth calls upon, and also came from within the Macbeths themselves. So again, that enabled us to walk this very fine line between things that may be predetermined and things that are free will. The reason why I share that is this idea of how the atmosphere in the room changed. I mean, the temperature of the room changed, the air quality, the thickness of the air in the room changed through the time that these actors had to create these embodied shame monsters, really. So that sense of how shame and the potential for violence that follows beyond that diffuses into the atmosphere and is carried within a body and embodied was incredibly palpable that day, I think, for all of us, you know, regardless of whether we were actors, directors, analysts, academics, you know, however, whichever perspective we were bringing to the space that day. It was quite a profound moment to have that made manifest in front of me.
Mark, I get goosebumps even as I think about that moment there, as you're talking about it. It was 100% electric moment. And the irony, the paradox of theater, or even rehearsal actually, is that by definition, you're not allowed to record those moments, because that's precisely the point of it, is you're rehearsing, you're experimenting. And if you're recording, that's not the same. And yet, you know, in those moments of rehearsal and experimentation, you get this chemistry which is like, goals, it's gone afterwards, and it's nowhere to be. It just exists in your memory. I think that's just the tragic beauty of the rehearsal.
I mean, yes, absolutely. And yet, just in hearing about it again, you said you've got goosebumps. So actually,
yes,
and use the word imprint. And I think that's a really great, I absolutely agree with you that actually it is ephemeral, and we didn't, because of the respect we had for the actors in quite a, a vulnerable thing that they were potentially doing, not recording in that space. And yet it somehow has been recorded because of the way that air quality changed, the way that experience manifested that day, that it did somehow imprint upon us, and somehow that energy is not only in our memories, but in our bodies somehow, that we can kind of carry. That's how palpable the experience was, that we can kind of carry that with us a little. And I sort of wouldn't swap that for a video, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, it was a very powerful moment that I remember in the rehearsal, and it brings up one's own feelings of potential shame and experiences and feelings of it, and thinking, should I be here? You know, this is quite something. And I remember being very impressed as well at the way that Mark held that space, allowing the shame to be experienced and manifested in the performances, whilst at the same time making it a safe and containing space for it to be performed. And that was quite an eye-opener in terms of the role of a director, actually. I thought that was very interesting. The other thing it reminded me was that in psychoanalytic terms, the origins of shame go back to a very early pre-verbal stage, and it's been likened to feeling dropped if you're not having that sense of mirroring back. It's about misrecognition, about not feeling held, and the shame that emerges around that feeling of mortality and vulnerability. And that this becomes embodied because we can't speak about it, because it's from that very early time. And so that shame is this idea, you've talked about it, has been quite fluid in a way of moving around, and the weird sisters enabling this too. And it's easily projected, and people don't want to own it and have it. And it gets so easily projected. And I was thinking also of the mood in that rehearsal room, but also from a psychosocial perspective. If we think of what they talk about the matrix, actually, the idea of a room or a group being like a womb. And I was thinking of the rehearsal space in that term, but also the links that it has to the wider world. And some research that I did a few years ago about Brexit and so on, shame was very much present. And if we think about that idea of a mood of shame, and it's present today in political culture and in society, it gets projected and moved around, doesn't it? We see it. So it's very prevalent. And I think there's no coincidence, perhaps, that Macbeth, which really deals with shame, is so popular at the moment. Every time you turn on the, telly or reading, there's another production of Macbeth. And there's something about the themes of that play which is speaking to people of the moment and picking up on a mood of a kind of unconscious structure of feeling. And I think the play really taps into that. And at a more micro level, in that rehearsal room, in that precious space, it was being enacted in a very intense way. And I'll always remember it. It was really, really powerful and set up a kind of mood of trust and a basis for the work that we did later.
I wonder if we can draw some of these ideas together. Macbeth does seem to be very contemporary, doesn't it? Of course, I was thinking as the three of you were discussing this kind of, the manual of shame, violence, Macbeth as a kind of manual. You can think of maybe Hamlet as a kind of manual of kind of neurosis and repression, and Macbeth as a kind of handbook of shame and violence, perhaps. And there's something very contemporary about that kind of that destabilized state, that state, as you were talking about, Candida, of thinking about being dropped or something that we're in at the moment. This kind of this need for some kind of stability, and the way that reaction can be, the reaction to not having that can be so violent, right? And I was also just thinking about, we used the word, things about being imprinted, Roman. I think that was a word that you used, and it really reminds me of this kind of Freudian notion of the memory trace that somehow is imprinted in the mind and kind of lays somehow dormant and is waiting to be reactivated somehow. And it's reactivated in the language, isn't it, that Mark just gave to that event, describing it, creating these goosebumps, reactivating this memory trace, I think. The transience of the moment as well, isn't it? There's that wonderful essay that Freud wrote called On Transience, about the beauty of things which can't continue, and that's that kind of transient nature of existence. And of course, the idea of the analytic space itself. I mean, because that's a space of trust, of fragility, of a dyad. Yeah, we have this kind of two-hander that Mark changed the play into a two-hander, just with two characters. There's transferential figures, aren't there, in the Weird Sisters? There's all these things that are coming up that are not actually there, but they're kind of part of the wider fantasy world of the unconscious. So many kind of rich currents, I think, that this analysis, just from this kind of workshop, that actually I wasn't present at, and I feel kind of very, very sad about that now. I guess that's the nature of transience, isn't it, really? At least I'm able to relive it in this kind of conversation. So holding on to all of those ideas, Candida, I would like to now ask you to think a bit about the event that we had in June last year. And if you wouldn't mind, just to kind of, describe how it was set up, the process of it, and perhaps how, out of what you've just said as well, how that there's something that was specifically analytic or psychosocial about the process of that event, how the specific setup and the structure was able to kind of create that atmosphere, perhaps, that you were describing.
Well, the event that was held, it was held in Freud's garden. Mm-hmm. It was in the middle of June, and the roses were out, and there was the trees. I think there was some lavender or lilac trees, and we all turned up, and it was very, very warm. And there was a panel. There was you, Tom, who spoke at a lectern to start it off. So we had a kind of learned overview, actually, about psychoanalysis and Freud and shame and Macbeth, which was really interesting as a way to start us all off. And then Roman spoke about his book and the place of shame. I can't remember what I said, but I'm sure it was, terribly. Anyway, I spoke about something, and then Mark, and it was Hannah, I think.
Yeah, Hannah Doug.
You. And you'd done a little quick rehearsal, I think, inside. And I think this inside-outside is quite important for the success of the event. It being outside in the beautiful garden, this sensory open space that allowed us to hold in mind the sort of inside, psychological, and the outside, which is a psychosocial approach that we were taking. And then what happened after we'd done our bit, Mark and Hannah enacted 2 scenes, and in between each scene, there was then discussion and interaction from the audience who really got into it. And the whole thing then was very relational, mirroring in many ways the rehearsal process, the organizational dynamics, because it works so well. And we've often thought since then, haven't we, Tom, why did it work so well? Well, partly because we all got on, but we worked hard together. But it was all very relational and open all the time. From a psychoanalytic perspective, of course, Winnicott talks about this, doesn't he? About a condition of creativity being not closing it down, of retaining a potential space. And Marion Milner also of not rushing to meaning or trying to create something too quickly, of allowing meaning to emerge. She's talking about painting, but I'm also thinking about rehearsal and acting and performance. And for academics, that's quite a scary, risky thing to do because we like to know. We want to know what's going to happen. But actually, we had to trust the process a bit, and it was a real pleasure to surrender a bit and to be held by this structure that we'd created, this psychosocial structure, which is about working through this kind of method, if you wants to give it a name. And so we held this event in the garden, and then what happened was that it started to rain. I mean, not massively, but it did. I went, oh my God. And I think at one point I turned to Tom and said, stop the rain. What are we going to do? So then people scattered a little bit. Some sat there, I think, and others scattered a bit to stand under trees, to go and get some wine, go to the bookshop, went inside the museum or hovered in between. Again, this inside, outside. And then we came back and people sat when the rain sort of stopped, and it loosened everyone up. And it wasn't just the wine, I don't think. I think it had sort of shaken us all up. It was great. And it kind of loosened up the atmosphere. And all the time we tried to keep the guiding principle, which was keeping the space open for something to emerge, of retaining this interdisciplinary feel.
I think part of what you're describing there, Candida, is this notion, we've spoken about fragility and chance. And I think you're right about academics. It's difficult in academia to be able to hold that space and not think about a kind of predetermined outcome, isn't it? I was going to ask you as well about, what you thought the outcome would be in this event before we started. But I wonder whether that's even a relevant question, actually. I mean, did we think about outcomes particularly?
Plus, I would say that the process is the outcome, right? And the beautiful way that you describe it of being open and allowing those meanings and interpretations to emerge, that is the outcome. The experience is the outcome. In the same way that attending a play or a performance, that will be the experience you get, and in the way Tom described it before, which is almost like you throw a pebble into a lake and then you get this ripple effect that, pebble is gone, but the ripple effect is there. And in the same way that we've all experienced the rehearsal and then the event in June, we're all affected by that, and it informs everything we do, whether we are conscious of it or not, to use that language. So it's I would say that the process is really key here.
And I wonder on that point then, process being key and not thinking too much about predetermined outcomes. I mean, you're all kind of very experienced in thinking about these themes now through research, through kind of workshops, through that kind of, being, I guess, embedded in this, this idea of shame and violence, particularly with this play. Roman, was there anything that was surprising that came out of that particular event, something that you weren't prepared for, or anything that kind of that took you by surprise, anything that shocked you as a result of that? Did you learn anything specifically that maybe you hadn't thought about before?
I wouldn't say I was shocked. I'm very aware of how brilliant actors in general are and how brilliant Mark and Hannah are, but just seeing them, change their skin like chameleons at a push of a button and then becoming Macbeth and Bellona, and just like having those interactions, I think it stunned everyone who was there. It is a little bit scary to see a human being, transform like that. It is epistemically confusing, which is actually relevant to shame themes, because shame is about, am I in control of the situation? And So we, like human beings, obviously struggle to acquire any kind of agency or control of our lives, and whenever we fail to do that because of our actions or because of external factors, we actually feel shame because we feel that we're being marginalized, we're being excluded, or other people are smarter than us or are controlling us. So I think one of the themes that kept coming up when we were reading Macbeth, and then when we went to the workshop and at the event again, is that idea that all of you actually mentioned of how current and contemporary and relevant the text is today. And the reason for that, and I think Jim Gilligan also writes about it very beautifully in his latest book about shame and guilt in Shakespeare, is that we are living today in a moment of profound uncertainty and malaise and change, technological, because of globalization, because of digital media, because of inequalities, and obviously the climate crisis and all the other things that are happening in the world. And you may be wondering what that has got to do with like anything, what has got to do with shame, but it actually really does, because as individuals, we feel very vulnerable and we feel that we are struggling to make sense of the world, and we're struggling to have agency. And that is really one of the most fundamental drivers of shame, is that epistemic inability to make sense of things. And it's a theme that as anybody who's ever interacted or cared for somebody, for example, with dementia, will know it creates a lot of anxiety, because you suddenly realize that things are happening which you can't explain, or that you have no control over. So whenever our control is taken away from us, it's very natural, it's very normal to feel anger, to feel that we're cornered. So these themes came out again throughout the process, and just really highlighted the contemporary relevance and the brilliance of Shakespeare, really, who at the time was describing a different kind of transition from an era of superstition and magic, and this is obviously where the Weird Sisters come in, to a more rational and human beings being at that fault line between reason and sort of superstition. And maybe without wanting to overstretch the point, today we are in a similar transitional period from that modernist world of reason and logic to something we can't quite describe yet because it hasn't fully formed. And maybe that's, I hazard the sort of the guess or the assessment that's why Macbeth is so relevant today, because those dynamics that are at the heart of the play are still relevant for these reasons.
The defences against shame are very visible, I think. If that's the right word, really. I mean, I'm thinking psychologically when I looked at jealousy those years ago, and how shame was such a powerful component of jealousy, that it could move into a powerful sense of shame at the helplessness, and that you can't control the other, in fact, that you can't make them do what you want them to do. And in terms of gender, which is a very powerful, again, element, the kind of dilemmas of gender in the play, I think, which is brought out so beautifully in the two-hander as adapted by Mark and the Faction. I think that's part of it too. I was also thinking, as you were speaking, about the psychoanalytic explanations and ideas about development in terms of the search for knowledge and certainty and wanting to know. Malcolm Bowie's actually linked this to jealousy, but this kind of endless kind of, like an empirical scientist wanting to know the truth, but it slips away. And these tensions that Roman has talked about in terms of rationality, reason and unreason, and so on, I think are there in the play of Macbeth and resonate very powerfully for people. If we look at these macho leaders as well as in terms of a gendered kind of dimension of this, and the very powerful kind of almost the hyper masculinity of some of these world leaders at the moment declaring war and strutting around. I think Macbeth speaks to us too at that level.
I'm going to say this to you, Mark, actually, as a kind of as a director and actor. I wonder if there's something in the process of acting, of being, of starting from somewhere, of having to respond to something that you're not prepared to respond to, that you have to be fragile as an actor, you have to be vulnerable, you have to allow for that epistemic, falling away almost, to allow something to happen. We talked about process rather than product, not predetermining. So it feels that there's something in that as an actor, as a director, that perhaps we, in these times of confusion, without wanting to stretch things too much, that there's something that maybe we can learn from that kind of vulnerability that an actor has to put themselves in, a director has, in those kind of live workshops. I was very moved by the way you were describing this shame monster thing appearing, and the fact that this kind of shaming within the body, and drawing on past experiences. Could you say something to that vulnerability, to that process, to that, that lack of an answer that you have to go through in this thing, and what that feels like and how you manage it, perhaps?
Yeah, I hope that's sort of for the job. I mean, many practitioners approach things in different ways, and there are a number of practitioners that would undoubtedly be very regimented and very rigorous and very planned, and would be working towards a more determined outcome. And that's just a different type of practice, and I mean no disrespect to it when I say that's not the practice that we operate in, and I know a number of practitioners for whom that's true. It was interesting for me to hear first of all Roman talk about the experience, the journey that is actually the experience, that it's not a product, and that actually that's very true, I think, of a creative process. It is the process and not the outcome, really. That for me as a practitioner individually is the most rewarding, and also that there never really is an end point. I mean, you go through a rehearsal process, you don't know where it's going really a lot of the time. Even if you do have preconceptions, you don't necessarily know where it's going, and that giving yourself over to the process, which we talk in terms of risk and failure and vulnerability and these sort of things, but actually it is a sort of releasing and freeing, and those are perhaps the slightly more joyful conditions for which and things like the rain coming down, or things that we happen upon, or the different stimuli and the cross collaboration that we're talking about here today, all of these things can lead to sort of happy accidents, that when you are open and when you are released, that actually something can strike, and it can be incredibly rewarding to have that moment of genuine inspiration and to have that sit and be carried forward and carried on into a performance. And then even when the rehearsal process sort of concludes, in inverted commas, that's not the end point. You then move into performance, and then you get the added stimulus of an audience who bring their own sense of what the play is, and the sense of atmosphere, and the sense of a contribution to an evening and a moment. And often, unless works in the theatre make space for an audience to sort of insert themselves, they're sort of not really going to function in quite the way that they might. And actually, that the way in which Candida was describing the actual process that we went through of the event on the day and how reflexive it was, that is what the nature of performance is like. And although those audience members only have that one moment, that one sitting to process what the experience is, even that's not an outcome. They then leave with the memory of that in the way we've already sort of described. And then the company goes on to the next performance, which has an entirely new dynamic. So it never really concludes, I don't think. I don't think there is an end point in any work of art, performing arts particularly, but even in the plastic arts, I mean, even in visual art, I'm not sure there is an end point. And that actually the outcome is the experience, as Roman said. The outcome is the process itself.
And Mark, if I may add that obviously you've worked on the text and you've worked a lot on text and the performance, but there's the need for people to just engage with something. And there's this opportunity for audience members to, as it were, work a little bit, right? To make meaning and co-create meaning. And it's just, I think that brings with a risk. You may get the rain, or you may get something, an evening where not everything goes great, or it's a few different things you're trying out fall flat. But we have to embrace that. I think audiences and people who participate in these kinds of workshops or in these kinds of events have to embrace that and be aware that this may happen. But for me, that actually increases the value of an event, because if there is the risk of something not going as it were right, quote unquote, that means that it's really alive, that that you're part of this, that you're not just sitting through a screen. There is so much need today for this kind of inclusive, open, interactive space where people where you explain things and you talk over things and you have a discussion. So I think embracing that risk of, okay, we don't quite know what's going to happen today. I think that's very authentic. That's very honest. Being honest with your audience, they have a part there.
Actually, two things from the Freud Museum which picks up on that. One was a few years ago, where there was a conference at University of Essex about teaching psychoanalysis to children, and I did a paper there. And Freud Museum had, there were 3 people from the Freud Museum who spoke about how when children go around the museum, they go, "Oh, Freud, what a perv," and things like that. And we were laughing about it. But we were talking about the need for that kind of riskiness in education, and how the value of bringing the arts and psychoanalysis or a psychoanalytic sensibility to learning and teaching. And the other thing was, actually in preparation to this, I was listening to your wonderful podcast on the uncanny and how you start off talking about aesthetics and the importance of that space and the subjective feeling that you get, that the meaning of art comes not from just the painting or whatever, but from our subjective feeling to it, and the uncanny and so on. It was making me think of that. And of course it sits well with the Weird Sisters and so on.
That's great. Candida, I wonder if I'm on the right lines by thinking about this comparison that's just been forming in my head between the theatrical space and the theatrical space of Freud's study, which is also a kind of, it's almost like a theatre set itself, isn't it? You can imagine the couch, the chair behind, all of these kind of objects everywhere. We have the analytic hour, of course, which is kind of, our kind of theatrical time to kind of work through things, that theme of working through that you described. And I think Mark was kind of put that so eloquently about this kind of, it never ends, and it's always, as long as there's an audience, and as long as there's an audience that is involved in it, as Roman said, we need to open up those, make things a little less polished perhaps in performance, and a little more kind of sparky possibilities for change. That really kind of brought me back to psychoanalysis itself and what it is, particularly how Freud defined it and staged it, in that consulting room. That we are working through, art and psychoanalysis has this kind of parallel narrative of working through something that doesn't come to an end, that kind of is interminable in a way, but it's about exploring a kind of richer, a deeper and more kind of fascinating human subjectivity. I wonder if, can we draw those parallels, do you think, between the process of psychoanalysis and art itself and creativity?
Well, yes, I think you can. And of course, there are different traditions in psychoanalysis, and depending which one you sit with or align with, you might emphasize different things. But if we go back to Winnicott, this idea of the facilitating environment or the holding environment, which is often by some people perhaps seen as a bit, it's about the maternal space and it's domestic and where's the excitement and but it's not just about being supportive and holding and loving and safe as you sit there, as in the analytic 50-minute. It's also there to allow the person to create. It's also there to be generative and creative, and to allow the person to be an artist, perhaps in that that moment, and without judgment and without it being closed down. The other thing which comes to mind, although we're looking very much at the visual, you've got the mise en scène of the room and so on, but I'm also, and the setting, it's the voice also, isn't it, in analysis is so important. Freud's voice, the analyst sitting, well, the classic sitting behind the chair, you can't even see the analyst, but you can hear the voice. There's something about the voice as a metaphor of allowing your voice to be heard, but at the same time, actually, there's also a physical dimension to it, as Anne Karp has written about this in terms of theatre and space and voice. So it's very rich, actually, the similarities between these two things that you're describing. But I think also as a way of telling one's story, I can see what you're saying there. I agree.
There's a wonderful paradox between a kind of a space in the study which is incredibly visual and rich, and then the process of laying down on a couch and not seeing any of it, and just listening to a voice. I think there's something quite wonderful about that, and strange and beguiling, and I think that can really mirror the act of the being in the theatre. There are moments at times, of course, when we just close our eyes and listen to a voice, and that can give us the richest picture that we can get with our eyes. But there's a beautiful kind of play of stimulation, I think, between the visual and the kind of auditory that we can really get from that. I'd like to give you all a final word, actually, in the spirit of reflecting and kind of looking back. Candida, and Roman, and then Mark, if you could just give us a few lines about what it was like performing and taking part in this thing in Freud's garden on this kind of fair and foul day, as we've heard. Candida, if you'd like to start us off.
Well, it was a wonderful, wonderful occasion. I really, really enjoyed it. And I hope that Freud will have enjoyed it too. And that perhaps he was sitting there somewhere or sitting on a cloud looking down. And I think personally, it was very exciting and satisfying, having worked so hard with the team really over the months before, with lots of preparation, and hard work and lots of meetings and talks and pleasure, and then bringing it to fruition finally through this event was very, very exciting. And for me, it exemplified a kind of psychosocial relational approach to teamwork and to creativity, whilst also allowing that space for something, the unexpected, to emerge. And I'll always remember it. And it was wonderful. And I think, yes, we're going to be planning another one. So watch this space.
Absolutely. Look out for that. Thank you, candidate. Roman.
Well, what can I add to that? I'll just say that the Freud Museum is a sacred almost space for me, as it is for many people, and it was just a huge honor to work with Candida and Mark and you, of course, in this project. The garden, particularly, is such a space of possibilities. As Candy was saying, it's an open space, but also it felt like a really enclosed, protective space. And in a way, to use Winnicott and Candida's sort of terms before, the Freud Museum as an organization and a space gave us that containing space to experiment and do this work. And as you all of you said, actually, it never ends. It keeps going. So I kind of have the sense that what we're doing here beyond Shakespeare, beyond Macbeth, is actually just really experimenting with the methodology of engaging with texts and with each other that is, I personally find, quite exciting. And thank you all for being such wonderful collaborators.
Thank you, Roman. That's great. Finally, Mark, please. Thank you.
Thanks for those lovely words. I just think how joyful it was, really. I think never underestimate the power of joy. And I think as an event, and I think, when we're dealing with topics of shame and violence and psychoanalysis and the world and that uncertainty that we've been speaking about, that I suppose it would be easy to imagine that might be a sort of heavy event or a challenging event in some way. And actually, in the sharing, in the exchange, in the investigation, in the curiosity, that actually it was a really joyful experience with actually a lot of laughter and a lot of sharing. And I think actually that's the rich ground where we all learn something. Actually, not when we're closed off and when we're ashamed or we're violent, but actually when there are moments of joy. So I will remember it as a very joyful event.
Wonderful. Well, that's great, and what a lovely way to finish. I mean, never underestimate the power of joy. I think I might put that on a t-shirt, Mark. I think that's a great way to finish. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.